Good afternoon. My name is Elizabeth Blazinski, and I am an associate curator here at the Virginia Museum of History and Culture. I am really delighted to welcome you to this afternoon lecture in our Scholar Series, and thank you again so much for joining us. This is now, though, your friendly reminder to silence any device that rings, bings, or beeps, please. First, we wish to acknowledge the generous support of Conrad Mercer Hall, who has endowed the VMHC Scholar Series. Conrad serves as an honorary vice chair of the Board of Trustees of this institution and has been and has been a champion of our work for decades. We also wish to acknowledge former VMHC President and CEO Dr. Charles F. Bryan Jr., whom this series also honors. Just some upcoming events to be aware of. Please be sure to join us next month on March 12th when Connor Williams discusses the book he co-authored with Ty Sedgley, A Promise Delivered, 10 American Heroes in the Battle to Rename Our Nation's Military Bases. A collection of stirring tales of heroism, A Promise Delivered is the powerful account of how 10 worthy Americans and one bipartisan commission joined the ongoing fight to reclaim our nation's history. On March 26th, Daniel Thorpe will be here to discuss his new work, Seeking Justice, the long legal struggle of an enslaved Virginia family. Professor Thorpe will tell the story behind Eunice versus Charleston's administrator, one of the most extensive freedom suits in American history. And so here today for our program, we welcome Dr. Rebecca Capobianco Toy. In Landscapes of Freedom, she tells the story of an emblematic community of freed people during the Civil War era. Some of the earliest acts of wartime emancipation happened in the Tidewater region of Virginia, where enslaved people voted with their feet and escaped the Confederacy by crossing into U.S. Army lines. At Yorktown, freed people developed their own self-governing enclave near, and in some cases on, the Revolutionary War battlefield. Toy describes that Black community, its formation, and its development well into the 19th century. She traces the effect of Reconstruction policy and the consequences that its subsequent rollback had on the lives of Black citizens. Toy also documents the Black community's attempts to commemorate its members' roles in the Civil War. The Black community fought to retain that memory, one that challenged not only the lost cause interpretation of the war, but also the federal government's efforts to privilege the revolutionary memory of Yorktown while ignoring its ongoing role in the larger story of American freedom. Rebecca Capobianco Toy received her PhD from William & Mary and currently serves as an interpretation and engagement coordinator for the Washington, D.C. office of the National Park Service. Her work has appeared in Civil War history. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Toy.
All right. Thank you, Elizabeth, for the kind welcome, and thank you so much to the Virginia Museum of History and Culture for having me, for Graham for the invitation, for everybody coming out today. I actually have to give a really special thank you to museum employee Sam Florer, who I went to William & Mary with. I don't know if you know this, Sam, but you are partially responsible for the fact this book exists, because Sam let me know that all of the Freedmen's Bureau records that I needed were digitized. And this was right before the COVID pandemic hit, so it was incredibly useful to be able to access those online. So a special thank you to Sam. Before I get into the book, I do have to offer a brief disclaimer, if you'll humor me for a minute. As Elizabeth said, I do presently serve in the National Park Service, but I am here today in my personal capacity as a scholar. All of the research and writing that went into this book was conducted while I was at William & Mary, and then later on my personal time. So I'm not representing the federal government today, and all of the conclusions and opinions expressed here are my own. So thank you for your patience with that one. But to get into the book itself, I wanted to start by talking a little bit about how this project started, because as the title suggests, it started with a question about our historic landscapes and a pretty mundane visit to Yorktown National Battlefield during my first semester of grad school at William & Mary. And I happened to come across the National Cemetery, which if you've been to Yorktown, you might notice that outside of the brick walls of the National Cemetery, there are actually more graves. So you can see that this photo here on the left, that is the back wall of the National Cemetery, and you can see there are graves outside of the walls. And then there are also graves across the street from the National Cemetery. And neither of these sites are extensively marked. They don't have fences, they don't have entrance gates or anything like that. But there are two what we call wayside exhibits. So they're pictured here on the right in the parking lot of the National Cemetery. And these two exhibits talk about the fact that during the Civil War, there was a Black refugee community on the site, which was called Slabtown and later Uniontown. And the waysides talk a little bit about the creation of that particular community during the Civil War, some of its sort of characteristics during the war, and then doesn't really address what happened to the community afterwards or why these graves are here outside of the National Cemetery. And I happen to have an interest in national cemeteries already. If you're familiar with the history of national cemeteries, they didn't exist prior to the Civil War. They were created during the Civil War because the federal government realized that if they were going to ask hundreds of thousands of people to die for their country, then the federal government had a responsibility to take care of them and care for their memory after they had passed away. And so national cemeteries were some of the very earliest public, federally protected spaces on our Civil War battlefields. They existed long before the larger battlefield landscapes were preserved. And so I thought it probably wasn't an accident that these Black refugees chose to bury their loved ones right outside of this significant federal space. And I simply wanted to know, what that story was. What was their relationship to this cemetery? Why were they doing this, etc. And as I started to dig into that particular history, what I found was that the history of this space and this landscape was much bigger than any of the questions that I was asking at the time. So as I mentioned, these signs interpret this small community called Slabtown or Uniontown, which was located back behind where the National Cemetery is today. But in fact, Black refugees settled throughout York County during the Civil War and maintained a vast network of what I call a landscape of freedom during and after the Civil War. And their history was very dynamic and had a lot to tell us about how Black Americans fought for and negotiated freedom during and after the Civil War. Yorktown, it turned out, was also sort of exceptional because if you're familiar with the history of wartime refugee communities, many of them disappeared when the Civil War was over. The federal government disbanded them, forced Black refugees off of the land where they had been located, and people had to move away. But at Yorktown, that didn't happen. People were able to stay in place, and we'll talk a little bit about how they did that today. But because of that, we can chart this history. We can kind of see how Black refugees began building lives in freedom during the Civil War and leveraged that work that they undertook during the war, in the post-war era, and even into what we call the Jim Crow era. So we, of course, have to start by asking how people ended up in this particular place. Why were people in Yorktown to begin with? And if you are familiar with the Civil War, you're probably familiar with the 1862 Peninsula Campaign. So U.S. General George McClellan attempted to take the Confederate capital at Richmond by proceeding up the Virginia Peninsula from the vicinity of Fort Monroe. Of course, the Civil War did not end in 1862. McClellan was not successful. But as the federal government and the U.S. Army retreated back down the peninsula, they understood that Yorktown held symbolic value, that there was value in retaining control of that particular place because of its relationship to the Revolutionary War, because of the way that Americans imagined Yorktown's significance. And so the U.S. Army stayed in place at Yorktown, creating, relative stability, emphasis on relative, right, because it's still a war. And of course, wartime emancipation, as we know, was very fraught. But anywhere that the U.S. Army was, enslaved people saw an opportunity to strike for freedom and took it, and that happened in Yorktown as early as 1862. And I really want to emphasize, as we talk about this wartime period, how complex this moment really was, right? 1862 is before the Emancipation Proclamation was issued. The 13th Amendment isn't official until after the Civil War is over. The 14th and 15th Amendments ensuring black citizenship and voting rights, they don't pass till well after the Civil War was over. And so, but black refugees in Yorktown were building lives without knowing how any of this was going to play out. They were sort of staking their claim, I would argue, on permanent freedom, permanent citizenship, and building and acting upon their visions of freedom long before the federal government had even guaranteed their protection. Some of the ways that we see this in Yorktown during this period is U.S. soldiers actually wrote about refugees from slavery arriving in U.S. lines in Yorktown with a whole bunch of stuff, like the literal home furnishings, furniture, wagons, horses, farming implements, tools, the like physical pieces of lives that they wanted to build. And I'm talking about things as significant as like a bed frame. Even though people didn't have houses yet, they intended to have houses, and they brought these things with them that they wanted to have in those houses. In other cases, individuals began building businesses right in the middle of the war. So one man, Robert Ruffin, he escaped from slavery in Virginia and went and served with a U.S. Army officer, which was pretty common in the middle of the war before black men could enlist in the Army. And he leveraged the money that he made working for that Union officer to invest in a general store that his father had opened in Yorktown, and grew a very prosperous business serving both soldiers stationed in Yorktown and black residents. We see Robert Ruffin's own account of that in the Southern Claims Commission documents, because he actually petitioned the federal government for restoration of some of his losses that occurred during the war. And many other black residents in Yorktown took up independent labor, things like fishing and oystering. And we see evidence of that in the notes of U.S. commanders who took over control of Yorktown, because they arrived and they looked around and they said, all these people, they're fishing and they're oystering and they're running these successful businesses, and we're not regulating it at all. Here's an opportunity. We should regulate these things. Anyway, I won't make a comment on that, but it is interesting, right, how these comments can tell us things that we might otherwise overlook about the parameters of the lives that people were building. So what did this community look like? Oh, this is a photograph of black refugees with U.S. soldiers at Yorktown. And then this particular sketch I wanted to share because it was drawn by a white teacher. Her name was Sarah Cadbury. She was a member of the Freedmen's Association from Philadelphia, who labored in Yorktown during and after the war, teaching, running businesses, different things in an effort to help black residents. And Sarah Cadbury actually sketched this image of Slabtown, and you can see some of the main buildings that were part of that particular community. And I want to emphasize again here that Slabtown was a sort of regularly laid out neighborhood that the U.S. Army constructed. The U.S. Army also constructed another, what I would call neighborhood, called alternatively Acretown or Newtown, separate from Slabtown here. But then people were settled on the farms and lands all throughout York County. So these were sort of like denser pockets of population of a much broader community, if that makes sense. So again, there's ample evidence that as the war was still raging, black residents in York County were in many ways already functioning as free citizens. And when the war was over and the Freedmen's Bureau arrived in Yorktown, the black residents' efforts to build independent lives actually often clashed with the lives that the Freedmen's Bureau wanted to direct. We often see the history of this era written from an institutional perspective, because the Freedmen's Bureau, they wrote down a lot of things. The white benevolent workers, they wrote down a lot of things, and they focused on what they felt like people needed and what they felt like people needed to be taught how to do. I mean, in Yorktown even, one of the white superintendents talked about how they were going to teach people how to farm. People who had been enslaved in Virginia, they thought needed to be taught how to farm, which I think is very interesting. But as a result, what we see is an actual clash between the Freedmen's Bureau and these white benevolent societies whose job it was to help black Americans, and black Americans themselves who they already knew what they wanted their lives to look like, and they highly valued independence and autonomy, and they didn't want to necessarily be told how they needed to build their lives in freedom. This is a photograph of individuals oystering on the Virginia Peninsula. And as I mentioned, when the U.S. Army commanders came to Yorktown, they noticed that a lot of people had engaged in oystering and fishing in particular. And perhaps not surprising, right? This is an independent industry. The Freedmen's Bureau was very interested in having Black Americans engage in wage labor farming, to go back to the farms where they had been enslaved during, before the war, to get the Southern economy going again. But people in Yorktown instead sought these independent industries where they could, control, they could own their boats, they could own their oyster tongs, and they could protect their personal business interests. And we see that, again, Black residents actively sought and then also actively protected these efforts. So one of the places that I wanted to share today is in a letter that petitioners wrote to the military governor of Virginia in an effort to protect their chosen industry on the water. So the petitioners, Carrie Red Cross, Samuel Scott, John Rich, Charles Red Cross, and James Christian, represented the interests of oystermen in the York County area. They wrote, quote, "In behalf of themselves and the others who live by catching oysters, the existing law of Virginia forbidding the catching of oysters in the month of June, July, and August bears grievously upon your petitioners." Recently, they explained, oystering had been, quote, "laborious and uncertain, furnishing the scantiest livelihood. The past winter and spring, the weather had been unusually inclement, and as a result, oyster catching was significantly less productive during that period than it should have been. Oystermen's labor during this period had, quote, barely sufficed to buy their daily bread, and these men wanted to ensure that they could provide for their families. They anticipated the response from white authorities and further explained, quote, "It is in vain that we are told to seek employment on the land. We have neither land, team, nor implements to crop for ourselves, and we cannot get employment without going to a distance and leaving our families destitute." Additionally, they noted, they had invested their capital in boats and tongs, and, quote, "Our skill is to oyster, and our business is on the water." In this last assertion, the petitioners identified that inherent conflict that was at work in Yorktown. They understood that white authorities were eager to prove the merits of free labor farming, and they sought to manage Black residents' labor and encourage them to farm for wages. But these Black residents, however, sought independent employment and wanted to protect their access to their chosen industry on the water. Red Cross and his fellow oystermen concluded their letter by appealing to their rights as citizens, as well as to the same logic by which the Freedmen's Bureau had been operating for the previous 2 years. Quote, "We therefore humbly pray," they wrote, "that an order be issued providing that all citizens of Virginia who have paid for a license to oyster shall be permitted to catch oysters at any season of the year." If the military governor met their request, they assured him, quote, "We can support our families." But if they did not do so, they would end up in the very position that the Bureau had claimed it wanted to avoid. They concluded, quote, "If driven from our lawful calling, necessity will compel some to beg and many to steal, who would otherwise live by honest labor." Their reference to all citizens of Virginia, of course, was a direct reminder that Black oystermen were now part of both the business and political community, and their rights must be protected the same as any other citizens. There's further suggestion that without a change in policy, many independent oystermen would become dependent on charity or resort to theft was also strategic. During this period, in the latter years of the Civil War and those that immediately followed, concerns about Black dependence were rampant. The Freedmen's Bureau and these white benevolent workers filled their letters and reports with descriptions of refugees as helpless, as needing assistance, and incapable of laboring for themselves. And so I would suggest that Red Cross and his fellow oystermen were positioning their case so that their white audience, the military governor of Virginia, would be more inclined to be receptive to their request. It's also an example, I think, of how Black residents not only sought independent labor, but worked to protect their right to access independent labor. We see other examples of this in the records of the Freedmen's Bureau Court at Yorktown. So the Freedmen's Bureau courts were meant to protect the rights of Black citizens who couldn't expect a fair trial in civil courts. And in Yorktown in particular, the Freedmen's Bureau court records are full of people bringing suits in front of the Bureau to protect their personal property that had been stolen, oyster tongs, boats, to negotiate business transactions where people had formed a partnership and then they needed to find a way to navigate themselves out of that partnership, or where Black businessmen were being taken advantage of, or white landowners were trying to take advantage of them, and Black business owners were pushing back and leveraging the force of the Bureau to do that. These efforts to create and sustain autonomous livelihoods paid off in substantial ways at Yorktown. As I mentioned briefly, in most cases, these refugee communities disappeared when the Civil War was over because the federal government returned Confederates' abandoned lands back to their pre-war owners, and the Freedmen's Bureau, in a strange twist of historical fate, the Freedmen's Bureau's job became to force people off of the lands that they had previously settled them on. But again, at Yorktown, despite their best efforts, the Freedmen's Bureau was not able to convince or force Black residents to leave. By 1867, Lieutenant Massey, who was the Bureau agent for Yorktown, was reporting that the county was, quote, entirely tilled by the colored man, and the industry and the thrift he has manifest during this year has been the subject of remark both by his friends and enemies. However, Massey, like many of his peers in the Bureau, believed that the large and industrious Black community was a problem. He continued, quote, there are still too large a number of freedmen remaining in this county. So long as they remain here in large masses, suffering and immorality must ensue. Massey went on to complain of what he called a clique of people at Yorktown that were working against the Bureau's efforts to convince residents to relocate. Massey had actually called multiple community meetings to talk to residents about relocation, to tell them about lands they could potentially move to, etc. And in every single instance, nobody showed up. Like they just refused to even entertain the idea. And Massey understood that this group of people who he felt like were a problem were helping people band together to make these choices, to resist in mass. And instead, community organizers actually worked to ensure Black residents could present a united front. And one individual, a person named Bailey Wyatt, who resided at Newtown, gave a speech that was so well articulated that the Friends actually published it in their newsletter to be circulated throughout the North. And I want to read some chunks of that because I think he makes a really powerful argument, and he does it much better than I ever would. So Wyatt began, quote, taking notice of the address the gentleman gave us last night concerning the camps, or leaving the camps, in which we are now settled in, and thrown back to the adjoining counties where we came from, under the present situation of the rebels and the unsettled situation of the United States, we shall be forever made hewers of wood and drawers of water. He went on to explain how the sight of free Black Americans was, quote, poison in the eyes of former Confederates, and that returning to the places that the Freedmen's Bureau was trying to send them was extremely dangerous. More importantly, he noted, quote, I may state to all of our friends and to all of our enemies that we had a right to the land where we are now located. Our wives, our children, our husbands have been sold over and over again to purchase the lands we are now located upon. And for that reason, we have a divine right to the land. Wyatt detailed how the U.S. government had promised them these lands, and they had made the decision to leave their places of enslavement and put their lot in with the federal government and join the U.S. cause, believing these promises, and that it was disappointing that the federal government was now changing its promises and reneging on the agreement that they felt like they had. Wyatt went on, we feel disappointed that they have not kept their promise. We were first ordered to pay rent, and we paid the rent. Now we have orders to leave, to have our log cabins torn down over our heads. They say these lands have been restored to the old owners, and they must have it. And now, where shall we go? Shall we go into the streets, or into the woods, or into the river? We have nowhere to go. And didn't we clear the land and raise the crops of corn, of cotton, of tobacco, of rice, of sugar, of everything? I say they have grown rich and my people are poor. Concluding his appeal, Wyatt implored his audience, quote, "Gentlemen, we must not depend on the warlike nations around us to help us. They have deceived us. They have combined against us to keep us out of the promised land. Now we must be united. We must take care of ourselves and protect ourselves and support ourselves. We must form societies to help each other who cannot help themselves, and we must show to the nations that we can support ourselves." That is precisely what Black residents of Yorktown did. They recognized that dispersing from the county would likewise disperse the community strength that they had built during the war. And so rather than comply with the government's wishes, they resisted, sometimes in force. Some bureau officers did. In fact, one wrote about a woman who actually pulled out an axe when he came over to the farm where she was to tell her she had to leave. But either way, people stayed in place. And when the Freedmen's Bureau left town because the government disbanded the agency, Black residents had to contend with the white landowners, and they resisted them as well. They leveraged their efforts to build independent livelihoods, to make money, to actually buy land outright and ensure that they could retain their homes and the communities that they had built. So this map, these two images, on the far left, you can see in the top left corner is the Yorktown National Cemetery. And then the map is a map of Uniontown shortly after the Civil War. That map was drawn up by the quartermaster's office to document the National Cemetery's development. And then you can see over here on the right, a plat map. So I mentioned that Black residents resisted white landowners' efforts to remove them. And eventually white landowners ended up subdividing their land and actually selling it off to Black residents. So this map is the plat map for Uniontown when portions of the neighborhood were sold off and purchased by Black landowners. And this is another map, as I mentioned. Uniontown is perhaps the most well-documented part of this landscape, but it's not the only part of the landscape. So on the left, you have a map that's a portion of the government farms and their status in 1864. And you can see up here some like subdivided land. And this over here is that land, again, subdivided for sale later after the war was over. So this is actually the Tinsley farm, which is just one of those numbered plots on the left, if that makes sense. It's a very inaccurate science we're working with here, piecing together some of these records, but hopefully it gives you a sense of how these larger farms were broken up into smaller farmable pieces of property in contrast to Uniontown, which was more of like a neighborhood with smaller acreages. Make sense? So, as I mentioned, by maintaining their community cohesion, Black residents of Yorktown were also able to maintain their political strength. And they leveraged that political strength throughout the end of the 19th century into what we know as the Jim Crow era. And Yorktown was actually sometimes referred to as a political stronghold for Black Republicans during this era. One of the places we can sort of see this phenomenon play out really clearly is in the political careers of two brothers, one Daniel Norton and his brother Robert Norton. So they both escaped from slavery in Williamsburg, came back to Yorktown. Daniel Norton in particular was a leader during even the Freedmen's Bureau's tenure. The local community actually wanted to appoint Daniel Norton to serve on the Freedmen's Bureau court. They voted for him to represent them, and the Freedmen's Bureau refused to seat him because he wasn't white. And in a very similar story, as you're already familiar with now, the Freedmen's Bureau tried to call elections to have the community elect a white person, and they refused to show up or elect anybody other than Daniel Norton. The Freedmen's Bureau court did not seat him, but he did represent Black residents in front of the Freedmen's Bureau Court and serve as like a legal aid for many petitioners in front of the court. But in the post-war era, Daniel and Robert were similarly political leaders in the area, and they made really calculated decisions based on the interests of their neighbors and despite the fluctuating political landscape of the post-war South. Throughout the 1870s, the Norton brothers pressed the Republican Party to uphold the ideals of equality that it claimed to stand for. Black Republicans on the Virginia Peninsula, as elsewhere in the post-war South, often found that white Republicans wanted their votes, but they didn't necessarily want to allow them to hold equal political office. And so frequently, the Norton brothers were pushing white Republicans on the peninsula to allow them to have an equal say, and in particular to be elected to political office. There are multiple instances where white Republicans on the peninsula would actually call nominating conventions without alerting the Nortons or their political allies in an effort to assure that they could not be elected as candidates to political office. And in response, the Nortons and their allies would hold grassroots political meetings to force the white Republican Party to acknowledge that the vast majority of the community wanted these two men and their allies to represent them as candidates. And so on the peninsula throughout this period, we see what one newspaper called a, quote, triangular fight, where on the ballot you have a black Republican, a white Republican, and a white Democrat. And often one of those black Republicans was one of the Norton brothers. On July 4th, 1874, black residents held a mass meeting in Yorktown for the purpose of nominating a candidate for Congress. And one newspaper described this meeting as, quote, one of the largest gatherings of the colored people and leading Republicans that has ever assembled in this section. More than just a political meeting, this event took the form of a mass rally, opening with a march consisting of more than 2,000 people who paraded through the principal streets of Yorktown and repaired to a stand in a grove to give speeches. Speaking to the crowd, Robert Norton declared that, quote, the time had come that the black man in Virginia should demand from the Republican Party, a party of which they compose so great a part, the right of representation in the offices. Black voters were, quote, the backbone and the sinew of the Republican Party, and he implored them to, quote, demand their rights and be tools no longer. Daniel Norton and other well-known Republicans also addressed the crowd, and attendees unanimously nominated Robert Norton as a congressional candidate. Neither of the Norton brothers served in the federal Congress, but they both did serve in a variety of positions here in Richmond at the state level, and then maintained county-level political leadership positions even after black candidates sort of stopped making it into the state government. So one more quick mention of politics here, another place that we see political action after the war was over. I mentioned at the beginning that I was curious about the relationship of black residents to the National Cemetery. And in fact, black residents in Yorktown did use the National Cemetery as a sort of political platform, especially through Memorial Day ceremonies. So we don't have a lot of documentation of these ceremonies, but what we do know is that Memorial Days during this era were led by the black community. That folks started at Shiloh Baptist Church, which you'll recall on that first slide that had sketches of Slabtown. That church was Shiloh Baptist Church. So they would start at Shiloh Baptist Church, they would proceed to the National Cemetery, and one National Cemetery superintendent commented that they would go specifically to what he called the black section of the National Cemetery. Now, national cemeteries were not segregated, but more than 75% of the post-war burials at Yorktown were veterans of the United States Colored Troops. So as far as I can tell, what happened was Yorktown ran out of space, and National Cemetery superintendents chose to start burying veterans on top of unknown graves, which sort of created the image of a black section in one corner of the cemetery, because all of these post-war veterans had been buried there. But it's important, right, that people were processing specifically to that section because they were calling attention to the service of United States Colored Troops, to their efforts to help save the nation and what that meant their place in the nation should be after the Civil War was over. Those Memorial Day ceremonies stopped when the National Park Service took over Yorktown. And you might be wondering, right, if there's such an extensive history over decades of time, why don't we see this history on the landscape today? And the answer, somewhat ironically, has to do with issues of historical preservation. So if you're familiar with the history of the National Park Service, you might know that some national parks existed before the agency itself. The agency was created in 1916 through the Organic Act. The first national park sites were the big western parks, places like Yellowstone and Yosemite. But Yorktown and Jamestown, which are pictured here, labeled as Colonial National Monument initially, were two of the first historical sites incorporated in the agency when the agency got into the business of historical interpretation. National Park Service administrators believed that the most important story that the landscape at Yorktown could tell was this history of the Revolutionary War siege in 1781, a moment that they believed sealed the future of the United States as an independent nation. And so as the NPS acquired land and made decisions about what they would have called restoring the landscape, and they defined their interpretive priorities, this belief that the siege was their, quote, most capital story led administrators to view any physical aspects of the area that could obscure visitors' understanding of this narrative as a problem. I want you to sort of think about historic sites as what I would call narrative landscapes, right? That, if you go to a park site, you might go to a ranger program and that person's going to tell you, whatever. But when parks are created, the physical aspects of the park are meant to speak to visitors, so that as you encounter the physical aspects of the park, you can understand a story even without having somebody come and narrate that story for you. And so that's what administrators were thinking about at this time. From the outset, they understood that the landscape at Yorktown had multiple stories. They understood that the 1862 Civil War siege was important, but they didn't believe that it was as important as the Revolutionary War siege. Clark Venable, who was a historical technician working for Colonial at the time, wrote to Vern Chatelain, who's the chief historian of the National Park Service, that he was concerned about, quote, the Civil War problem on the Yorktown field. As the NPS considered how best to interpret the site to visitors, Venable believed that marking both the Civil War and the Revolutionary War histories would be a mistake. Quote, to the average visitor, he insisted, Yorktown is a colonial and revolutionary field. To ask the average visitor to be continually jumping from the Revolution to the Civil War is to ask a mental transition too swift and too sharp. Put a lot of faith in the average visitor's abilities there. But moreover, Venable felt that NPS was already at work establishing Civil War battlefields elsewhere that he felt were more important than Yorktown, places like Fredericksburg, Petersburg, Richmond, Manassas. And so he thought to mark the Civil War story at Yorktown would, quote, accomplish nothing by example, little by way of education, and would destroy Yorktown as a pure colonial field in which it stands alone. And again, this philosophy reflected prevailing interpretive thinking in the Park Service as a whole at this time. This question, again, of how to organize the narrative landscape to make it legible to park visitors preoccupied park staff. And administrators thought any physical, visible intrusion on that landscape would be a problem. Arno B. Kammerer, the director of the National Park Service at the time, instructed Floyd Flickinger, who was the superintendent of the park, to ensure that as visitors traveled from Jamestown to Yorktown, the landscape would form a, quote, unified and connected story. Again, the entire design of the park and the decisions about what to preserve and what to remove had to reflect this commitment to a single Revolutionary War story. For his part, Flickinger, the superintendent, explained to a crowd in Richmond that, quote, the National Park Service is giving in its study of historical educational methods a good deal of attention to the development of the nation and of the progressive unfolding of history through contact with the physical sites where history has occurred. Collectively, these sites would form a, quote, more or less complete narrative, and from them we can watch American history go by. So they didn't want Yorktown to tell this, broader narrative. They wanted it to tell one part of the story, and as visitors proceeded to other National Park Service sites, they would get other histories. Concern over the restoration of the Revolutionary War landscape also led park administrators, unsurprisingly, to set their sights on the landscape around the National Cemetery, on Uniontown, formerly known as Slabtown, Shiloh Baptist Church, the Masonic Cemetery, which is the cemetery that's behind the National Cemetery, and actually the National Cemetery itself. They tried to remove that too. Obviously not successful. By 1935, park administrators had already collected the history of land ownership lots for Uniontown, as well as the names of families who had outstanding taxes due and liens on their property. In detailing the history of the park's land acquisition program later, Park Superintendent George F. Emery would describe this phase as a buyer's market. And again, this is the 1930s. So his veiled phrase was skirting the heart of the issue, which was that the Great Depression was in full swing in the United States, and families who were desperate to make ends meet were more likely to sell land at lower prices to the federal government. But the federal government also didn't have a lot of money, and they ran out of land, or they ran out of money to acquire all the land they wanted to in the 1930s. But they circled back in the 1950s and 60s. So in December of 1964, Park Superintendent Emery wrote to the director of the Southeast region that the matter was pressing. Quote, "As acquisitions are delayed, heirs multiply. A number of Yorktown battlefield properties show ownership dates into the 19th century. The many heirs involved in claims to these estates will make it necessary to institute condemnation suits to clear title. Condemnation suits allow the federal government to forcibly take land that people might not otherwise want to sell." So 100 years later, Colonial National Historical Park Superintendent ignored the dynamic history that this reference to ownership dates into the 19th century, people who had bought their land right after the Civil War and passed it down, what that represented. Families who had clung tightly to their footholds in freedom, gained ownership of land, passed that land and its legacy down to their heirs. Ultimately, Colonial National Historical Park succeeded in removing what was left of Slabtown, and Shiloh Baptist Church was moved outside of the park, and those who were unwilling to sell were forced to do so through those condemnation suits. In 2015, Floyd Hill, who was a former resident, remembered that the loss of Uniontown to the park's expansion, and he recalled that, quote, "The only thing we were able to keep was the cemetery." And of course, the physical landscape of the park attests to this reality. So on the left here, you see, again, the National Cemetery up there in the left-hand corner. The folks who owned plots in Uniontown at the time that the federal government was seeking to dislocate families. And on the right, again, you see the Yorktown National Cemetery in the top left corner and an aerial Google map view of that neighborhood today. And you can see it's just woods. There's nothing. The roads, interestingly, are still marked, and you can kind of walk back there a little bit, but there's nothing back there. So why does this matter, right? Beyond the fact that I think, it gives us, again, a great window into the ways that Black Americans imagined and constructed and fought for freedom when the Civil War was over. And the fact is that while the National Park Service has worked for nearly the last 100 years to tell a unified story, this history is obscured, but it's not lost. It has long been my personal hope, at least, that if historians and communities do the work of restoring these histories, we can likewise positively influence the many agencies who administer our shared public lands and encourage them to expand their narratives. While Yorktown's history is in some ways unique, it is also a case study in how landscapes that present themselves as authentic historical relics are often, in fact, carefully constructed and limited. In the context of the broader National Park Service, these spaces have been conceived of as spaces where Americans could and should go to understand the United States past, present, and contemplate its future. And yet at present, these spaces often only represent a fraction of our larger collective story. I would argue that the story of Black residents at Yorktown is a fundamental piece of the evolution of freedom in the United States, the reconstruction of the nation after the Civil War, and of our continued work of making and remaking the parameters of freedom that democracy requires of all of us. All too often, we reproduce exclusion under the guise of preservation, and if places like Yorktown are meant to represent the United States, they should reflect the complexity of our stories, right? That's going to help us all understand our shared past better. To do so is not to erase the past, but that rather do justice to the stories that we have excluded from our commemorative landscape for far too long. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much. We have 2 microphones, so if you just raise your hand, we will come and get you.
Thank you. I'm trying to get oriented here.
Sure.
I understood you to say that in 1862 the Union Army remained in that area as an occupying force, I assume. But also you said that the black refugees were essentially homesteading on captured land. It was okay. I just wanted to make sure that I had that right. Thank you.
Yeah, yep. The federal government fairly early in the war began what they called confiscating lands. So if white landowners were loyal to the Confederacy and had abandoned the land, so in a lot of cases in Yorktown, when the Union Army was coming up the peninsula, families left. So the federal government considered those abandoned and considered it essentially allowable for the federal government to take control of them, and then they allowed black residents to settle on them.
Thank you very much for this presentation. I'm curious as to why the Park Service takes over this land that you see in the neighborhoods on the left, but then it really doesn't seem like they've done anything but just let it return to wildness.
It's a great question, and I don't have an answer for you as to why they made those decisions. I've heard from descendants that it's pretty disappointing to say this is an important landscape that we need to interpret and then leave it overgrown, because at the time of the revolution it would have been open ground. So you can see in the Google map image that some of the earthworks have been restored, but not all of them.
Right, if they were so worried about keeping the American Revolution history, it's actually just been so much covered up.
Yes.
It's an amazing story. I'm so pleased you presented it to us today. If these were enslaved people who were not allowed to be literate, their writing, their business acumen was just marvelous. Do you have any ideas as to how that came about?
Sure. Yeah, a couple things. One, I think as you're getting at here, I think we've barely scratched the surface of really understanding the communities that people maintained during slavery and the ways that people strategically supported one another and themselves during that era. And the things that people, because I think you can see at Yorktown that there wasn't a big learning curve, right? People had that business acumen going, even as the war was already raging. And what we also see at Yorktown is a very strong prioritization of education. So I didn't talk about it today, but I talk about it in the book. White benevolent workers, one of their primary goals was to establish schools in the South. But at Yorktown, it's actually black residents who start schools first. The ones who were literate opened up schools for their neighbors and began teaching one another how to read and write. And then the white workers often took over those schools and sometimes brought books and things down from the North. But there's an 1865 census of that the Freedmen's Bureau took, and it shows families across the county and the status of their children in particular. And like in every single case, the children are in school. They're not working. They're not doing anything else. Their families are sending them to school, and the parents are going to night school. And there are a lot of accounts of adults attending school, even despite the physical dangers of that proposition, actually arming themselves as they traveled through different places in the county to get to a school in order to access that education. So absolutely a priority.
Thanks very much for your talk. Very interesting. The parallel that occurs to me is with Shenandoah National Park, which is kind of the same period and the same process, of residents who maybe didn't have the greatest courthouse, ties to their land, but were certainly living there. So that's one parallel. And the other thing I would ask is what effect that the 1881 centennial might have had on this whole process.
Yeah, those are both great questions and observations. I would just say wholeheartedly yes. The story of Shenandoah and other mountain parks like Great Smoky Mountains is very similar. In Shenandoah, it was primarily white residents who were displaced by the federal government in order to create this what they wanted to be a wilderness park. And it's only been in the more recent decades that Shenandoah does actually interpret that history. They had an exhibit on it a while ago. And then as far as the 1881 centennial, it was interesting because Yorktown was somewhat kind of conveyed as like a backwater during this era, but the centennial brought a lot of infrastructure. But unsurprisingly, Black residents were not really included in those celebrations. And then at the turn of the 20th century is when we start to see particular white writers coming to Yorktown and talking about how this revolutionary place, this place where the ghosts of Washington, you can feel him walking around, right, is entirely occupied by Black residents, and people starting to think about what that means and maybe thinking about the historical landscape that they would prefer to encounter in Yorktown. And then, of course, as the 20th century evolves, we have people start creating the movement that led to Colonial National Historical Park, right? Because, of course, all national parks are created through legislation, through some kind of political action.
Thank you so much. That was just fascinating and just what a surprise for those of us who didn't know the story. Have you been in touch with people whose descendants, whose land was condemned in the 60s before it was allowed to grow over? Were they fairly compensated? Where did they go?
That's a great question. So I did a lot of this writing during COVID, which of course sort of changed the dynamics of having conversations with people. But I have a good friend who is actually a descendant of refugees at Yorktown. And so I will steal what she has shared with me to answer your question, which is that theoretically people were compensated, right? Theoretically there were land swaps. Theoretically the federal government built homes for people in places outside of the park. My understanding is that the quality of those homes wasn't necessarily great. I think Shenandoah has a similar story in that regard. But also, like, the point that she has made is people were grounded in the land, right? They had that sense of ownership of this land and this history of kinship and of legacy of fighting for that land. And so even if, like, monetarily it was theoretically a 1-to-1 ratio, the deeper meaning of the place was still lost.
So if we go to Yorktown today, do we get one or two? How many stories? What do they share historically?
That's a great question. It's a great question. There have been, as I mentioned, there are the waysides in the parking lot. They have a small exhibit in the visitor center that talks about Slabtown a little bit, that I believe was created by some college students. There was a park ranger who worked there. She has since retired, but she did a lot to dig into this story, and she actually shared her research with me while I was doing this project, even though she was retired. So my understanding is some of that interpretation comes from her. I can't say what the park's intentions are, especially in our current climate. The sands are shifting pretty significantly right now. So I think it's an open question, but a question that we all have a right to have a voice in, too.
This will be our last question.
I wish I had a more exciting one. I'm just, where is the Shiloh Baptist Church, and is it landmarked in any way, like a historical sign saying where it came from?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I am terrible with geography, so I can't give you directions. It is not that far down the road from the National Cemetery. I think it's by a middle school, and it's still called Shiloh Baptist Church. And they do maintain, like on their website, they talk about their church's history. So I think
Thank you.
internally, it's definitely remembered. Sorry.
Thank you so very much. And thank you all for joining us this afternoon. I also will say, if you are interested in this topic more broadly, we do have an exhibition up on the second floor in the Good Gallery called Unbound, Free Black Virginians, 1619, 1865. So it dovetails very nicely into Dr. Toy's talk. Please join us also out in the lobby. She will be signing copies of the book. And again, thank you all for coming, and see you March 12th.